So diffusion and osmosis, right? Diffusion, as you can see, is a movement of substances through a medium, okay? And in some places, you'll see it described as across a barrier.
Okay.
Or membrane. Now, diffusion on its own, right, can mean the movement of stuff that's in liquids, solution or whatever, across a membrane or whatever. But it can also mean, for example, like gas particles. So gas, liquid, and dissolved particles as well. Right, like for example, with the gas one, when somebody's cooking in the kitchen, right, often the smell will spread through the house. Yeah, so you can have a smell spreading. Why is that, right? That is basically the particles, like of food or whatever it is that's coming off the saucepans and etc., right? They will spread out through the air, right? Because of their high velocity and kinetic energy. Okay? And they spread out, all right? Now, in biology, the one that you're particularly interested in is the one to do with stuff moving in and out of, for example, cells, right? Or an organism, okay? So across a membrane and stuff like that, all right? So let's take this example. I'm going to switch the color here. Okay. So this one, imagine that those things are glucose particles.
Yeah.
All right, glucose particles, molecules, if you like. Right, in water. All right, same here. Okay. Now, in this case, you can see that obviously we have more glucose on the left-hand side than we do on the right-hand side. All right.
Yeah.
And this is some sort of a membrane or barrier. So you can call that like the cell membrane, for example. All right. Okay, so this one is the high concentration. And on the right-hand side is the low concentration. All right. The rule of diffusion is that particles will always move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. All right. So in this case, the glucose particles are going to move like that. Okay? So that's the definition. And I'll just put that in. So, particles always move from area of high concentration to low concentration. Okay, that's the formal definition. So if it comes up in a GCSE question or something, that is what you're expected to write. Okay? So that's the first bit. Now, the bit that I really want to focus on and explain, all right? And this is what a lot of people get wrong in the, whether it's a GCSE or a practice question or whatever it might be, okay? It's the word concentration, all right? What does a concentration actually refer to? Concentration refers to the amount of solute. Now, what's a solute? Do you remember?
Is it like something that dissolves?
Yeah, it's basically the substance that is dissolved in a liquid. All right? So in this case, the solute, e.g., it can be glucose, it can be common salt, it can be minerals, whatever it is that's carried in the water. So this effectively is my solute. Right?
Yeah.
So the high concentration, low concentration refers to the solute, the stuff that's dissolved in the water. All right? The thing with diffusion is that if I were to, sorry, let me just do that again. That diagram, if I were to put it on some sort of a graph, let's just imagine I put it in a bar chart or something, all right? So you could have something that says you've got a very high concentration, and next to it, something with a low concentration. Like that, yeah? So, high and low, all right? And so what happens is that the movement of the substance, it's going to go like this. Do you see? That's what they mean about the concentration gradient, all right? So the concentration gradient that you're seeing is effectively the difference between the two concentrations, all right? The bigger the difference, concentration gradient is like that. Obviously, the bigger the difference, the greater the gradient, the steeper it is. So that means how steep the difference in concentrations is. Okay? So if I just do another example, if you had something that's, I don't know, like that versus that, then that's not such a steep. You can see the difference. Yeah? So this is a high concentration gradient. Yeah? So high gradient and low gradient. Okay? And the higher the gradient, i.e. greater the concentration gradient, the greater the rate of diffusion, the quicker things will move. Basically, if you think about it like this, if you're sliding down a hill, right, on a sled in the snow or something, the steeper the hill is, the faster you're going to go down the hill, right? And if the hill is not very steep, it's rather shallow, like the second diagram, then you're not going to go as fast, all right? So that's a simple way to picture the rate of diffusion, okay? Right, that brings me on to the next thing that always comes up in questions, all right? the three things effectively that mainly affect rate of diffusion. Okay, first one, as we've just seen, the concentration gradient.
Yeah.
I'm going to write conc for short. I've written out concentration like 20 times already. All right, concentration gradient second effect, second factor that affects rate of diffusion is often surface area. All right, and the third one is the diffusion distance, and I'll talk about each of these. Okay, we've already seen why the concentration gradient affects the rate of diffusion. All right, so to improve the rate of diffusion or keep it high, right, you want to maintain a high gradient. All right, so that, for example, e.g. like blood supply. So let me just talk about that for a moment. You know, like in your lungs, right, you're diffusing gases in and out of your lungs. So the blood absorbs oxygen from the air, all right, and it gives up carbon dioxide. If the blood didn't move, it would slowly, like here, let's say it started off like this one here, right? There'd be a big difference between the oxygen in the blood and the oxygen in the air, all right? But as the oxygen goes into the blood, the difference between the two, right, will reduce, it'll decrease. And so there won't be such a big gradient, right? So the rate of diffusion will decrease, okay?
Yeah.
But what happens is, what we just said here, is that you're constantly getting blood flowing through. So each bit of blood picks up some oxygen, goes away, and then some fresh blood arrives that doesn't have as much oxygen. So you're always maintaining a high concentration gradient. So there's always a big difference between the oxygen in the air, in the lungs, and the oxygen in the blood. So you always get very fast diffusion of the oxygen from the air into the blood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes
All right.
sense.
Okay. Surface area. Again, sticking with the lungs. Yeah. Surface area means more particles can pass through. All right, at the same time. In the lungs, I'm not sure if you've studied the lungs fully yet, but we have these structures called alveoli. All right, they're little spherical structures within the lungs which increase the surface area. So instead of just being straight, flat surfaces, there are actually lots of little curved surfaces. They sort of look a little bit like cauliflowers, I suppose. Like that, all right? Now, you can see if I had the same size and I just had one thing like that, yeah, the surface area between the two, this one has more.
Yeah.
So that one allows for more oxygen, carbon dioxide, anything else that you want in the lungs to move from one side to the other, compared to just a straightforward sphere or a flat surface. All right, does that make sense?
Yeah, makes
All right. The next one is diffusion distance. And the best way to explain that is to talk about thin membranes. All right. So, for example, if you were to try and breathe through your skin, all right, no joking, there are organisms that actually absorb the oxygen or other gases that they need through their skin. All right, they don't have a breathing apparatus. So, if we as people try to breathe through our skins, you can't. Our skin is way too thick. It's several millimeters thick. All right. You've got the skin, you've got the fat, blah blah underneath it, right? It doesn't work. Okay. So again, in the lungs, what you have is, and if I go back to the alveoli type of example, so just taking one little piece of the alveoli, imagine you have one bit like that, right?
Yeah.
That's one bit. The blood supply, the capillaries, are actually wrapped around it, and let me change the color again there. All right, it's actually wrapped around it like this. Okay, like that. All right, and that contains the red blood cells. So that's how the blood is flowing. And there. Okay, so blood cells, red blood cells, of course. Okay, and that thing is a capillary, which is the thinnest, the narrowest and smallest blood vessel that we have in organisms and human body. All right. So the distance that the gas has to move, and if I use, I don't know, find another color. Let's try this one, right? So the distance that the gas or whatever has to move is very short. Straight across the membrane into the blood cell, all right? So again, it means that it can travel that distance very, very quickly, all right? So that is the important part of the definition here of diffusion distance. So short distance. All right. Now that diagram, I know it's a bit simple and crude, but it illustrates all three of these points. First of all, you've got blood with very low oxygen content, all right, constantly moving, flowing through this capillary. So it doesn't sit there and just absorb oxygen. It takes some oxygen, moves on, and the next person comes along. All right. And then the surface area, because it's a spread out spherical structure, it maximizes the surface area. All right. Therefore, there's plenty of opportunity for the gas to diffuse through. And the capillary is right next to the membrane of the alveoli. All right. And therefore, there's a short distance for the gas particles to move. All right. So all of those three factors that we've talked about, they improve the rate of diffusion. So they increase the efficiency of diffusion of substances. And all of this, right, is relevant to stuff that you're going to be doing in animals, plants, right, and other organisms. Okay, so very, very important. When we come onto things like transpiration, translocation, roots absorbing minerals from the soil and water, all of these. In animals, again, it's like the movement of substances around an organism's body, right, in and out of the lungs, in and out of the cells, etc., etc. Okay? Any questions on that so far?
No.
No? All right. Now, here's the bit that I wanted to talk about with concentration. Remember what I said about students making a common mistake? Yeah? Come back to this diagram here. And I'm going to completely switch colors because I think this is really important. Okay. Now, you can see already on the left-hand side, we have a lot of glucose in the water. On the right-hand side, much less glucose, much fewer particles. All right? So we know that the left-hand side is a high concentration of glucose. Right-hand side is low concentration of glucose. So we've explained all that. All right? Now, if we think about water, oh, I hope this is visible. All
Yeah, I
right?
can see it.
So water, okay? If we think about the water now instead of the solute and the solid particles, all right? Which side has more water, relatively speaking? Let me explain that. It's the right-hand side. Because here, on the left-hand side, you've got, proportionately speaking, much more of the solid particles relative to the water. On the right-hand side, you've effectively got fewer of the solid particles relative to the water, right? So the water is actually, there's effectively more of it on the right-hand side. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. So if you like, I'm going to use the word relative. So relatively more water, okay, and on this side less water. All right, does that make sense, the logic of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, now if there's more water on the right and less water on the left, and let's say your glucose particles couldn't move, all right, and that's where we talk about what's called a semi-permeable barrier, all right? So imagine now that membrane stops the glucose particles moving, all right? So only the water can move. Which way is the water going to move?
Is it going to move from the one with more water to less water?
Exactly, all right? So the water movement is going to be in that direction, all right? Like that, okay? So that'll be the water movement. So that is osmosis. Right? It is exactly the same as diffusion. The rules are exactly the same. The principles are the same. But it's simply the movement of water. So it is a diffusion of water, if you like. All right? And I'll now write that in a proper definition down at the bottom here. Okay? So actually, okay. Osmosis it's the movement of water across a semi-permeable Did you come across that word in your notes yet?
No.
All right. The semi-permeable, what that means is only allows some substances through. So in this case, we're going to say water. Okay? Only allows the water through. Yes, all right, you can have semi-permeable that is designed for other particles. But in this case, when it's osmosis, we refer to the water. Okay? Like that. All right. Now, again, as we've just seen in that diagram, and remind you again of that, okay? Remember, diffusion is the movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Yeah?
Yeah.
The water is obeying that rule. It's moving from where there is more water to where there is less water. Yeah? So it's obeying the rules of diffusion. The problem is, right, remember what I said, the word concentration refers to the amount of solute, does not refer to the level of water. We don't say what concentration of water do we have. So a high concentration solution always refers to the solute, the solid stuff dissolved in it. All right? And low concentration, again, the solid stuff. All right? So if you ever, and this is the bit that I really want you to understand, and ask me any questions you want, all right? Water, because of the definition of high and low concentration, referring to the solute, the water is actually going to go from a low concentration solution, yeah, and that is what I need to add here to explain that, to a high concentration solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah? And students in GCSE answers often say, oh, if it's high concentration solution to low concentration solution, the water is going to move from high to low. It doesn't, because osmosis works opposite to the normal diffusion that we've learned. Yeah? Does that now make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. So just to tidy that last point up, right? So water moves from, yeah, from high conc solution, right? And we've got the low conc solution. The water actually moves this way. Do you see?
Yeah.
Right? And this is where you have more water, and this is where you have less water. So the logic still works. It's not breaking any of the rules of diffusion. But whenever we talk about water diffusing through anything, we call it osmosis. All right? Everything we've done so far. Any questions? Anything you'd like me to explain further?
No.
Yeah? All right. Later on, right, there'll be things like water potential. You know the concentration gradient? Okay?
Yeah.
When it comes to water, so concentration gradient of the water is actually called the water potential, or osmotic potential. You may come across that. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. And the places that will come up later, when we'll cover it when we get there, are things like transpiration in plants, where the roots push the water up the plant because it creates a high osmotic potential, etc., etc. So those come in later sections. All right. Any questions on that at all so far?
You know, like the gradient of like normal diffusion, wouldn't it be the same? Is it like the same for not concentration of water, but for osmosis, the water potential?
Yeah. What about it? Sorry, ask that again.
So like, you know how like basically diffusion, like the gradient is like high to low, so it goes downward.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. I understand your question now. Let me show you that way then. So looking at the less water, more water, whatever. I know how to do this. Hang on. Let me... Yep, okay. Here, all right?
Yeah.
That kind of diagram. So if I do that now with exactly the same thing, look what happens. Imagine that is the water in the high concentration, right? And this is the water in the low concentration solution. Yeah?
Yeah.
And look at which way the water's moving.
Downwards.
Yep. Do you see now?
Yeah, I get it now.
So the solute will go in one direction and the water will go in the opposite direction.
Okay.
All right? Does that answer your question, what you wanted to
Yeah.
see? And does that help you visualize it?
Yeah.
Yeah. That, if anything, I'm going to end the recording on this. That part there, I think, probably most clearly explains the difference between diffusion and osmosis. They obey exactly the same principles. The same three factors will affect, right, the rate of that movement of particles. But normal diffusion is diffusion of particles. But when it refers to water, we talk about osmosis.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Any questions? Any other questions on that?
No.
All right. Great. Let's pause there then.